Hello and welcome to ET Now Mega Special. At the Times Network, we have started a new mission, India Revival Mission. What could be that vaccine to reboot the economy? Over the next 60 minutes on ET Now, with our star CII panel, we would debate, deliberate, assess, and perhaps argue that what needs to be done individually, at the company level, and by the government in order to ensure that post the medical success, the economy does not hit a grinding halt. So without much ado, let me quickly introduce our star CII panel. We've got Mr. Sanjiv Puri, Chairman and Managing Director of ITC, Mr. Venu Srinivasan, Chairman of TVS Group, Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General with CII, Mr. R. Mukundan, Managing Director of Tata Chemicals, and giving him company is Mr. Sunil Mathur, Managing Director and CEO with Siemens India. So next 60 minutes we'll cover manufacturing, consumer, capital goods, pretty much all the major industries to get a 360-degree view of the economy and what needs to be done. So good evening to all of you. It is indeed a pleasure, and if I may add on behalf of ET Now, a rare pleasure to have such a star panel with us on the same forum. So Mr. Puri, let me start with you first. I guess my introduction was the question in itself. What to your mind should be the big vaccine to kickstart the economy and revive the economy? What do you think needs to be done urgently and needs to be done quickly?
Thank you, Nikunj, for having me on the show. No doubt that India has made a reasonable achievement in terms of containing the number of cases of COVID. I think it's now time that, as the Honorable Prime Minister has said, that we have to focus both on lives and livelihood. So to my mind, the most critical piece is the revival of the economy. And when I say revival, revive it to reasonable capacity levels so that livelihoods can be protected. And in particular, the agriculture and manufacturing value chains, where about 68% of the workforce is employed, it is very critical to revive these value chains completely. And in these value chains, if you add the services that are dependent on it, the employment potential, the economic multipliers are much larger. And we have seen, of course, that in lockdown 3, there have been some more relaxation. So economic activity some more has started. But I think we still have significantly more progress to make in this space to get to a reasonable capacity level. The value chains of agriculture and manufacturing are quite complex and interdependent. And therefore, it is important that manufacturing activity should be restricted only in very, very limited zones, like, say, the containment zones. And outside of that, manufacturing activity should be allowed to resume. No doubt, we have a responsibility, and every company is fully committed to it, to ensuring the highest standards of safety and hygiene in the workplaces. The fight against COVID-19 is a longish one, so it's really a new normal. And we have got to adapt to this new normal, revive economic activity to the optimal level while ensuring all the safety standards are followed. This, to my mind, is the most critical piece, because the longer it takes for economic activity to revive to a reasonably level or an optimal level, the greater the distress will be in the economy. And that is where the quantum of support or relief that is required will multiply as the days pass by. So I think more relaxations on the ground and allowing all manufacturing activity outside of containment zone is critical. And insofar as the relief and stimulus is concerned, I think it's most important that relief is first provided to people who most need it, the vulnerable sections of the society. And it was nice to see that the government reacted to that very speedily as soon as lockdown 1.0 was announced. But perhaps more needs to be done there. There are also sectors in the economy that, particularly small and micro enterprises, and there are sectors indexed to travel and hospitality that have acute levels of stress. And they will need support in terms of liquidity, in terms of payroll support, and they will certainly need that to survive through this crisis, and then hopefully revive and do something more beyond that. So really, I think the first step is more important for economic activity to revive to a reasonable degree. And for that, I think some more restrictions need to be eased out, particularly in allowing manufacturing activity outside of all containment zones, and simplify the processes so that execution on the ground also much simpler. And of course, the relief that is required is to vulnerable sections of society, to small, medium enterprises, and to sectors that are in acute distress.
Okay. Mr. Srinivasan, when we spoke to you last time, it was a complete lockdown. Now it is partial lockdown. Activity has started in parts of south. What has been your experience with the initial days of partial lockdown? And do you think more than partial lockdown, now we should prioritize lifting of complete lockdown? Mr. Srinivasan?
Well, partial lockdown has been lifted, but I think for each factory to get its clearance and the number of people will be allowed to work, I think the collector's office is flooded with requests. So they're taking time to process it, which is fine. It will take 2 or 3 days, depending on the company. But I think before we go to full opening, what are we going to do with the full capacity? Right now in the automotive industry, there's no demand. Our dealerships are all closed. Barely 20% of dealerships are open. And many of them will be in this containment zones. Third, people don't have money. As Mr. Puri was telling you, micro, small and medium industries are in great distress. So if the demand doesn't pick up and we don't do the quantitative easing or expansion, put in $100 billion. This is a number I've been using consistently because about 5% of the economy. We have barely done 1%. We need to do another 5% and give money, moratoriums to small, medium or micro industries, maybe a year's moratorium on principal and at least 6 months moratorium on interest. We have to put money in the hands. Every country around us has done between 5 and 12% of GDP as the expansion, fiscal expansion. Therefore, the most important thing is, when do we fully open? We fully open when there is full demand. As it stands today, the automotive industry is looking at a fairly bleak prospect of 35% reduction in demand compared to last year. And that to April, May are practically zero. So we would like the government to come forward to really support demand. And they must start with the migrant labor, the poorest of poor, but they must go up the value chain to lower middle class. They announce 1,000 rupees a month for 3 months. Needs to be something like 5,000 rupees a month for 3 months. And I think we're just not doing enough on the fiscal side. The monetary side has been done very well. And most importantly, I must say that we must recognize the Prime Minister for taking the bold decision to really enter into full lockdown in a country like India. That was a very big step, very bold step. But now equally, we need a very bold step in reviving the economy and the demand.
Fair point. Mr. Banerjee, there are only 2 ways in which you can stimulate the economy, monetary and fiscal. Now, some would argue that Reserve Bank of India has done their bit and banks are not lending. But on the fiscal side, Mr. Banerjee, everybody wants something, but the government's ability to do something for everyone is not there. So what can be done on the fiscal side? Because everybody knows that the ability of the government to go full throttle in terms of spending, the headroom is just not there. Mr. Banerjee.
So actually, this is a very important point, and where we are at this point in time, and as Mr. Venu Srinivasan was mentioning, we have seen a lot being done actually by the RBI in the last few weeks, and now the flow needs to be there, which is very important. So banks today are averse, so to say, towards lending, while we have because they are risk averse and there is a need for them to be risk averse. So we need to see how the flow really takes place, and that can happen only if we see a lot more in terms of backstopping by the government. So that's one big area that is what's very important and required. So there is concern amongst the industry on the cost of moratorium, so to say. So clarity on the cost of moratorium should be made known to the borrowers, as the interest calculation of the moratorium for all the loans should be just a simple interest basis and not compound interest. And there is a delay, say for instance, in the implementation of the moratorium clause, and the industry is also concerned at this point in time at the one-time accumulated interest that will be required to be paid on the moratorium. So the repayment of the deferred working capital loan interest moratorium, so to say, must be considered in equal installments, maybe six installments or so. So what is very, very important, which is coming out, that there is a lot that needs to be now done. What's been happening over the last few weeks and months, over the last month or so, is while we have been able to take control, and we have really, India has taken charge, so to say, of to fight the COVID, but we need and we are on the right direction. But there is now needs to be a sort of a package which needs to come out for the industry, a sort of a support the mechanism that comes out for the bank. The MSME has been mentioned over and over again. For instance, the government can really allow, considering and guiding the banks. Again, I'm staying on the point of banks, to allow a one-time window for restructuring the loans for the MSME, which have been really badly impacted today by the pandemic. And the restructuring of loans will help customers repay the loan on regular basis when things really normalize. So what we really see at this point in time, that while there has been a lot of good work which is done, what is important now, that the package is becoming more and more essential, or business will go completely lost. And today there is also a very big concern on job losses, on contraction of business, both the top line and the bottom line. So there is a low demand, there is low prospects. So the next 2 quarters are definitely a washout. But companies can still, I believe that the companies can still, they are holding out, as you have talked about in the survey, and they need to, of course, they have got certain challenges to pay the workers at this point in time, and therefore the packages becomes all the more important, because that's what's really important. So to conclude, really, one really looks at an urgent sort of a fiscal stimulus as the need of the hour, as any further delay will sort of stymie the prospects of India staging a sort of a V-shaped recovery. And India's stimulus package pales when really compared with the other countries. So the focus of the stimulus should be really on measures which will alleviate the immediate liquidity concerns, without really exacerbating much on the fiscal balance. Today, we really need to forget about that. The entire work on the entire concern that is being raised from time to time on the FRBM. We need to take care of of course, the marginalized, which is extremely important. But we really need to see that the industry concerns are well organized. So cash transferred for the poor, support to the enterprises, and also we will come probably later during the course of the discussion on also preempting the bank failures. So I would really look at this really coming out at this point in time.
Okay. Mr. Mathur, before we get into specifics, what has been your experience of the partial lockdown, and how do you see things evolving for a sector which is dominated by capex? Capex happens when you're confident of growth, and cost cutting happens when you're trying to cut corners. So would you like to first elaborate as to what currently has been the impact of lockdown, and how partial lockdown has made life easier, better for you?
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Nikunj. The impact of the partial lockdown has actually been hugely counterproductive. The problem with a partial lockdown is you never really know where your supply chain is actually going to be functional. Now, you have got factories that are partly in green zones, some factories in orange zones, and some in red. And the red factories cannot function, but they are part of the supply chain. So you have this complete integrated supply chain, which is now got disjointed really because of it being a partial lockdown. And I think this is really what has impacted industry the most. The fact that factories cannot reopen, but just opening a factory is not good enough. You need the supply chain to work, you need the logistics to happen, and you need customers to open as well. And I think that is what has been the major missing link right now in the partial lockdown, because factories haven't been able to open. Even if some have been able to open in green and orange zones, a lot of their supply chain is actually in the red zone. And therefore, I go back to the point that Sanjiv made right in the beginning. We need to really concentrate on opening up everything, the entire economy, with the exception of containment zones. And there we need to be extremely consequent in ensuring that the containment zones are ring fenced and no one can go in and no one can go out. The impact of this has been huge. Firstly, we are in India, many companies in India are part of global supply chains. India has been virtually the only country that had a complete lockdown in manufacturing. Now, even if you are producing a widget in India and exporting that, and it is a part of a global supply chain, it blocks the entire manufacturing process of your customers abroad. So that has been something that is really beginning to hurt and has hurt a lot of companies here in the country. Um, it's also about the unpredictability. You can't go back and tell your customers when you are actually going to be allowed to open up and deliver to them. So they don't get what they are looking for, and you can't even tell them when you're going to deliver it. Linked to that, you have the complete issue of small and medium enterprises. And I think this is where it is really hurting, particularly in the capital goods industry, but in most other industries as well. As you know, most MSMEs are working on working capital cycles of 30 to 60 days. Now, with a lockdown of this sort, where they can't produce, they have their fixed costs, and they have no revenues, this is really hurting. They cannot restructure workforce, it's not permitted. Their fixed costs continue, and they continue to get deeper and deeper into debt. So I believe there are multiple requirements here. We are looking at first opening up everything, and it's opening up not only the supply side, but also opening up the demand side. Retail needs to be opened, malls need to be opened. And I don't think there's a contradiction about being unsafe and opening up the economy. Factories and manufacturing locations and offices and malls are some of the safest locations because this is where they are in enclosed areas, and those who run these locations will ensure that they are safe at all points in time. This is not only about moral duty, but also it just makes good business sense. The second part is, of course, we've got to figure out how we handle the moratoriums, and that has been mentioned already by CB. But also, more than that, we've got to see how can we reduce the MSMEs from getting deeper into debt. And here I believe there is a requirement to see how we can get funding into them, but there's a greater requirement to see can we find other avenues to make it easier for MSMEs at this point in time. If I'm a large company, I depend hugely on the MSMEs in my supply chain. And if they are not healthy, I cannot produce. Now, and this is where we need to see whether the government can come in with maybe tax holidays for the MSMEs, maybe Provident Fund ESI is paid by the government and it doesn't get burdened to the MSMEs. Maybe electricity and water is provided free for some time. But these are kind of things where we've got to find a way to make companies really more healthy at this point in time. The other point is in the direction of raising the demand. Infrastructure is really something that provides the maximum amount of jobs and also feeds most MSMEs in the country. And I think we do need to do something much more to revive infrastructure and revive real infrastructure. We are talking about roads, we are talking about bridges, we are talking about railways, we are talking about airports, real infrastructure. The steel business is in real turmoil at this point in time. And when you have industries like that, which are fed by a whole lot of MSMEs down the line, they are all suffering.
Right.
So it is critical to get all that back up and running.
Right. Fair point, Mr. Mathur. So, Mr. Mukundan, we got a consensus going. Perhaps this panel feels that something needs to be done in terms of giving comfort to the SME and the MSE sector. Now, the house you represent, Mr. Mukundan, has no credit problem whatsoever. But if I simply put facts out here, there is enough and more liquidity in the system, so much so that RBI has to now absorb everything from the reverse repo, which means nobody is in a mood to lend or perhaps take risk. So, Mr. Mukundan, do you think that is the biggest problem now, that financial institutions do not want to take the risk? Banks are in the business of lending and taking risk. Guess what? Nobody is lending and taking risk. What can the sovereign do in this case, Mr. Mukundan?
Nikunj, thank you. I think you probably hit the nail on the head, and there's a unanimity amongst all the participants on what is the issue at hand. I think there's one fundamental issue. There's fear in people. You can open the malls. I don't know how many people will go unless you give them a sense of security. I think that must be addressed at the core. Similarly, there is a fear in the borrowers. There's a fear in lenders. I think this whole chain of fear has to be removed, which is why I think some of the measures which CB mentioned, Chandrajit mentioned in terms of certain moratorium, certain impetus needs to be given. But I want to go back to the medical analogy you gave, which is when you have a patient whom you have taken into induced coma, how do you get him back to normal life? You go through stages. You go through a stage which is called ICU, then you go to ITU, which is intensive unit, then you go to general ward, then you are released in the outside. So I think we need a proper phased approach and a plan which is articulated right up front. So, and I think we need to open these things up in a regular manner with clarity that there's going to be a final end game. The second issue is about the fiscal problem which we've been speaking about. I do believe that India has got strong foreign exchange reserves. We have got many positives going for it. I agree with what Sunil has just now said. This is a golden opportunity for us to sort of go ahead and unleash some of the reforms we've been waiting to do. Because you should never waste a good crisis, from taking actions which are right for us. And if we take those actions, even as we go through the step-by-step process of firstly protecting the vulnerable, secondly addressing the MSME issues, thirdly opening up the retail and the front-end sales so that the entire chain can start to function. As you move through this, you will also have an influx of foreign capital coming, which may be in search for an alternate home. So there is a phase 2, which is doing the reforms in preparation for foreign capital to come in. But before that, we need to get our house in order. And part of that getting house in order, in my view, is not just fiscal and monetary, but also goes at the deep-rooted reforms we need to do now. And I think this is the right time. I think many of the issues which industry is facing, for example, different interpretation of law, different interpretation of rules, even though government has acted with a lot of agility, I think those things will ultimately go away if we go through proper reform. So I think fundamentally we need to take away the fear, bring in a sense of hope, and while doing so, we also need to ensure there's a plan available which people can work towards.
Okay. Mr. Puri, what has been your experience? Because what Mr. Mukundan has touched based on is about clarity. And clarity will only emerge if there is a collective or perhaps a coercive effort by the state and the center. Each center is following a different lockdown policy. Since you have presence across India, manufacturing across board, you are in FMCG, agri, cigarette, tobacco, a lot of categories. Do you fear that there could be there is a huge coordination issue which needs to be addressed urgently, Mr. Puri?
See, the manner in which the economy is, or the economic activity is reviving, it's really in certain steps over time. There are regulations that have been issued by the center which provide some relaxations. And then there are certain guidelines that come from the state, sometimes stricter. And then there is the element of execution in the ground in various districts. So certainly there is a need for some more consistency, there. And I think that if we have lesser restrictions, the whole situation will ease out much faster. Because what is happening, for example, if you look at this issue of migrant labor who lost jobs, did not have work to do, and there was an anxiety to go back. Now, as the industry is reviving, now the industry also needs these people to come and work either directly in the industry or support the value chains in various activities that are dependent on the value chains. Now, this is an area, for example, where industry and governments now need to work together to see how we get the people back and the capacities can be built up. So I think certainly between all the stakeholders, better coordination would certainly be helpful. And more importantly, I think lesser restrictions is the way out. So there are less exceptions to be dealt with. For example, in manufacturing activity, if we make it simple, let's have only in containment zones that manufacturing activity is kind of restricted. And as Sunil mentioned, there are a lot of interdependencies. So unless all those interdependencies are dealt with, for example, if you have workmen in areas where workmen cannot come, or there are a lot of restriction for movement of workmen and the industry is open, then also it doesn't solve the problem. So therefore, I think lesser number of restrictions, very sharp focus on containment zones, and letting activity move more smoothly, I think is the way out. That's the only way that the issue of logistics will get sorted out. That is also constrained because of manpower. So we need to get the people back, and we need to ease out all the regulations on the ground and get activity back on track.
Now, before we take a break, I'm just going to go to Mr. Srinivasan for one more question. Now, Mr. Srinivasan, never waste a crisis. A comment which Mr. Mukundan made, I think, is a very valid comment. We are on the right side of medical news. We are on the right side of oil, and whatever is happening to China will translate into great opportunity for India in terms of getting benefits of a new supply chain. What needs to be done, and which could be an out-of-box idea, which will ensure that India gets lion's share of attention, flows, and boost to manufacturing and exports? Mr. Srinivasan.
First, let me go back to one point, because everybody is talking about we don't have fiscal space. This is what you said, Nikunj. But FRBM specifically provides, in emergency conditions like this, Dr. Rangarajan has said it clearly, other economists have said it, provides for busting the fisc, monetizing the deficit, print the money and put it in the hands of people. I think both Mr. Puri and Mr. Mathur have very clearly said that if the small and medium industries start collapsing, it will end up in a bank collapse. It is like the pebbles on top of a slope starting to roll down. Those are the self-employed, the micro, small industry, and it will balloon slowly but surely to a huge landslide of financial crisis for the banks. So I think first we must take care of the fiscal while we look at the supply chain, because Those points I fully agree with. We have the same problem. The auto supply chain, many people are in Pune, many are in Delhi, many are in Chennai. Some of them may even be in containment zones, or the employees may come from containment zones. We have to deal with all that. And we need a very clear, streamlined policy. But if you don't take care of the fiscal and take care of micro, small, medium, self-employed people, you are going to have a huge financial crisis which the banks are going to face. So I think that is, to me, paramount at this point in time. Every other country has provided it. All of them have problems. But in an emergency, if a patient is in ICU, again going back to what Mukund said, you have to give him drugs which you won't normally give him, which may raise the blood pressure but hit the kidney, or which help the kidney but hit the heart. So when you're in a multi-organ failure, you are managing it like a aircraft which is constantly unstable and keeping it flying. So I think right now we have to take measures which are emergency measures and not go by the normal textbook on fiscal discipline and control.
Like the Prime Minister himself said, we are at war, and at war rules have to be changed, and rules have to be innovation and out of box thinking is required. So we're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll try and define the new normal. What is the new normal for India Inc? Is India prepared for the new normal? And what are the other out of box things which can be really done in order to ensure that the recovery for the economy is smooth, rapid, and better than the world? Thank you for staying with us. You're watching India Revival Mission, our mega exclusive. We are in conversation with best of India Inc. And we are really trying to understand, debate, deliberate and discuss, not argue, what could be the vaccine which will fix the economy. So CB, I'm going to paint the picture of where we stand. World is moving from partial lockdown to complete normalcy. Globally, central bankers and governments have stimulated 5 to 12% of their GDP, and whereas in India we've not heard anything grand or anything magnificent from government so far, apart from really giving helping poor of the poor and Reserve Bank of India moratorium. So frankly, on the government action, do you think somewhere industry is not very satisfied?
I'm very tempted also, before I take on this question, to really venture into the point that you raised just before the break, and that was what opportunities lies ahead of India as we go ahead. And I really would like to mention something, and with this, there is a huge opportunity in the waiting for us. And I'll come to your question, which is very important. Just the Prime Minister's strategy, really, that he spoke about, to get more investments into India and to enhance our domestic investment is absolutely apt at this point in time, and a comprehensive sort of a scheme which would include setting up of industrial zones with a complete plug and play infrastructure, as well as financing support, would address many hurdles that are faced by industry and foreign investors at the grassroots. We need to focus on that, and I would suggest that these should be really large zones with a special purpose vehicle to provide approvals and clearances, along with world-class urban infrastructure such as road, worker housing facilities, sewerage and low-cost power, and so on and so forth. And labor regulations can also be specifically instituted really for these zones, and to ensure large-scale employment, which is really possible. And I have strong belief that the government is working on several possible schemes, and we really need to see how this can translate into attracting the capital, which is so much more today, looking at India positively. But this is one opportunity that we should not lose. Having said that, I'd now come to the question that you really asked. And I would think that we really need, as far as the fiscal and what we are really looking at the government, I would imagine, and you rightly was pointing out the type of interventions that we have seen from countries all over the world, with the United States with a 9.1% of the GDP, or a Japan 3.5% of the GDP, or Germany, which has gone to about 4.5% of the GDP, UK going to 5.5%. India can definitely, but the reason why India can was explained by some of the very eminent panelists here. But also, if you see our debt to GDP ratio, that's something that India should really look at very, very carefully. And I see that there is a big possibility of us to really look at that very strongly, and that can really be stepped up. So there is this is really the time for the government to avail of debt options, and the debt to GDP ratio can really be stepped up. And the government can use this space for expanding credit to industry and boosting demand. And what we would also really expect the government in terms of the stimulus package to really focus heavily on infrastructure build up. The national infrastructure plan should be really fast tracked, and there is need to provide this a huge amount in hands of the in hands of the poor. That's another section that we really need to do. That's an additional support that we have talked about, and an additional support that could really go to the lower strata of the informal sector. Those who are self-employed operators, so to say, they are that's very important. Providing the cash transfer, which could amount anywhere to about rupees 2 lakh crores, so to say, to the JAM accounts, to the JAM account holders, and cash transfers should be done in tranches to maintain the demand level, which is at this point in time so important. We talked about the wages and interest support, which is important, but banks should really provide that additional working capital equivalent to anywhere in, say, April-June wage bill of the borrowers, backed by a government guarantee, which is extremely important, of 4 to 5%. And I would end by saying a similar carve-out could also be provided for an April-June interest obligations for the stressed sectors, because we must understand that besides the small-scale industries, which is the MSME, there are large chunks of the large industries which needs to be looked after, because again, if the large is not looked after, it will be difficult for the small also to be looked after in that chain. So I would think that it's time now for us to look at the stress sector, be it aviation, be it the hospitality sector, be it many others, which needs to be now focused on. So we need a plan. We need a plan for the marginalized. We need the plan for the poor. We need a plan for the MSME. We also need a very, very strong plan for the stress sector, and today India has that fiscal space. I would strongly believe that India has that fiscal space to provide
that. Mr. Mukundan, while financial markets, the terminology which we are using is that this is the worst crisis according to IMF in last 100 years. Parallels are being drawn between the market crash and 2008 sell-off. But do you think this is a time to not talk about 2008 or 1929 or 1930? It is time to talk about 1991, when Indian economy was in a deep mess and big ticket reforms were taken by the government that time. Do you think we need such solid, bold and life-changing reforms now?
I think I truly believe that we must do all the emergency measures. When somebody is in ICU, as Mr. Srinivasan said, that we need to first get that patient out. I think we need to take all those steps. But after he comes out, you need to think about what is he supposed to do. I think that is the critical issue. So we can't return to the same normal as we had before. Some sectors will take much longer time, but yet we need to get those people who need jobs every year, get them jobs. And I think which is why it is important that we look at the future also. And in looking at the future, working the same way as we work now, with all the hurdles for businesses to do in terms of policy frameworks, I think is not going to help. We need a new policy framework. Countries are opening up. Countries are becoming more freer. They're becoming more welcoming of industries. So if you really look at it, I think if India is such an attractive destination, leaving China, why would not companies come into India? They've gone more to Vietnam. They've gone more to Thailand. They've gone more to Indonesia. I think we need to get them to India. And I think we need to look at those policies, why they are not coming into India. And we've been speaking about this at length. This is not, every industry wants to give employment. Every industry wants to protect labor. Every industry wants to give equitable wage to labor, but labor reforms have to come. And it's very, very critical piece in this whole puzzle. Similarly, we've spoken about power sector reforms. Those have to come. You take sector by sector, I think this country is waiting to be unleashed if we actually take this opportunity to reform. If we don't do that, I think we'll be back to the same normal. So we'll go back to our 6, 7, 8% growth, but we'll lose a big opportunity what we can get in terms of getting to double-digit growth as we come out of this crisis. Today, we are looking at how do we get back to at least 0%, which means we at least don't degrow. But I think stage will come, it will become 3, 4%. But do you want to settle at 5? That's my question. My question is, why can't we think about going beyond? So I fully agree with what everybody has said. We must loosen the fist. This is not the time to have a tight fist. This is also the time to do reforms. And I think we must think completely out of the box, but in a very structured manner. Every Indian company wants good companies from international markets to come here because we're all part of the global supply chain. Only when we are part of the global supply chain will we be able to also accelerate our growth. So it's in everybody's interest. So I really think we all need to think. We've been saying this for many years, but I think this is a great opportunity. That's my view.
Mr. Mathur, so let's divide what can be done in the short term, which is immediate, today, tomorrow, this week, next week, and let's talk about the long-term prescriptive things which need to be done, which usher in a lot of long-term capital, move manufacturing here, make our supply chain better. So if you have to divide 2 or 3 points in the short term and 1 or 2 points in the long term, how would you like to devise it? How would you like to differentiate them, Mr. Mathur?
I think on the short term, a lot has already been said, but I would actually go back to the area of infrastructure. I think private sector is not going to spend at this point in time. They are under stress, as we've all been discussing. So it is upon the government at this point in time to start spending. And government can really start spending in infrastructure. Now, they really need to get their arms around this. This will kick off the rest of the economy because that's what we actually need to take us off. So that's the first part, which I would really encourage that we actually start doing in the next fiscal package, which I hope will be announced sooner than later. But then let's move back to the point that Mukundan mentioned as well about how can we make India really an attractive place to make in. And we have talked a lot about make in India. We've talked a lot about finding an alternative or providing an alternative to other countries around the world. But let's just elaborate a little bit more on what that actually means. When you talk about make in India, for example, you are looking at the Prime Minister's vision, which was to go from 15% of GDP manufacturing to 25% of GDP. Now, just quickly do the math on that. If we are talking about roughly $2 trillion or $3 trillion of GDP, you're talking about $450 billion right now contribution to GDP. If you want to grow at 5-7%, and we are looking at 7 to 8% growth in the medium term, I hope, very soon you will get from, say, 3 trillion to 6 trillion. 25% of 6 trillion is 1.5 trillion. So we are actually looking at adding almost $1 trillion of contribution to GDP. Now, adding $1 trillion of contribution to GDP means we are looking at least at $1.5 to $2 trillion of capex coming in as a possibility over the next 5 to 7 years. Now, that is a huge amount. There aren't any countries around the world that are looking at those kind of dimensions. If we are looking at $1.5 trillion or $1 trillion of capex coming in, all the international companies will be looking at India and will be looking to get into this country. What are the international companies doing on manufacturing? Industry 4.0. Now, if we set up $1.5 trillion of capex, we will not be able to have business cases in the country to service that capex alone. So we will have to go and export. When you start exporting abroad, who do you meet? You meet the same international competitors. What are they doing? Industry 4.0. And therefore, the next real leap that we will need to start getting into is really smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0. This is something that when you are looking right now at this point in time, what are companies looking at? They're looking at conserving cash, they're looking at saving capex, they're looking at increasing their productivities. All these three things can be done through digitalization and smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0. I think this is really our opportunity. We have the best software experience here in the country. We are going out and selling our software globally. Our software engineers are adding value globally. There's no reason why they can't be used for supporting us over here to take India from where we are to where we should be, where we are capable of getting into. So I would really plug for infrastructure and then for digitalization, not necessarily in that order, but together, and they can start right now, and they will be our future in the years ahead.
You know, it's a great point that we have all the ingredients to bake a perfect cake. We just need to now set at the right temperature, which is where reforms and the government action kicks in. And given that right now there is mess in the world and collapse in oil is the cherry in the top. So, Mr. Puri, let me understand from you, what will be the new normal for ITC and for consumer companies? You know, if we have to divide the world, as historians do, AC and BC, but let's say if a consumer company has to do pre-COVID and post-COVID, how would you define that for us?
Before I come to that, let me make a comment on your question of the opportunities post-COVID. I completely agree with what others have said, you know, to create a very competitive environment so that India becomes the most attractive destination, and the points have been well articulated. I just want to draw attention to the opportunity that is there in the agri value chains and the forest wood-based value chains. I think that's a huge opportunity. India can do a lot more on exports, not only of commodities, but value-added food processed. The percentage of processed food in India is in single digits. It's very small. There's a great opportunity because that will also do a lot of good for the agriculture economy, where about roughly half the workforce is employed. And they will be, for the first time in this generation, people have understood what the environment is supposed to be. We have seen how fast the environment has healed itself. And that's the kind of demand that consumers and society will have going forward. So there's an opportunity for us to look at, production that is sustainable, agriculture production that is sustainable, certified, look at the greater focus on certifications, organic, and so on and so forth. There are very many strong areas that India has got. We can also look at the areas of reform that are required in those areas like the APMC Act and so on and so forth. I think that's a great opportunity we should not miss. It can do a lot to a large number of people in the economy. Now, as far as the consumer trends are concerned, see, it's the early trends very clearly indicate that there is greater interest for, and naturally so, for health, nutrition, and hygiene products. There is a greater interest to have stuff delivered at home as against going out, whether it's packaged food or hygiene products, or it is even food. There is a greater preference for all that to be delivered at home. And the point I think I made on sustainability is going to be, I believe, it's already an undercurrent, and I think it's going to only get accentuated going forward. Consumers are going to demand these kind of actions from every member of society. I think the interesting discovery is also that the neighborhood kirana has become very important, and people will remember that. He had been under stress for some time as the modern retailing was growing. I think his role has got quite well understood at this moment, and I think he will kind of also benefit from it. So these are some of the trends. I do see that staples category probably is going to hold on much better. Of course, there will be some muted demand at an overall level for some time till we fully recover. But staples probably will hold out better. Discretionary categories are going to see a fair amount of stress for some time. And organizations will need to be agile to spot the opportunities and switch gears. Like, for example, during this crisis, there was a lot of demand for sanitizers. So we repurposed a perfume line into a Savlon hand sanitizer line and so on and so forth. So we need to be agile and watch these opportunities and shift gears.
Fair point. So we got just a couple of minutes left, and Mr. Srinivasan, I'm going to blend two questions into one. When do you think, where is the auto sector headed? Because auto companies were really trying to migrate from fossil engine or combustion engine to electric engine, and then the crisis has come in. And second question, Mr. Srinivasan, it's not for the first time you've seen crisis. You've seen 1991, you've seen 2000, you've seen 2003, 2008. How do you convince yourself to remain optimistic? So two questions into one, sir.
First is this too shall pass. I think we've seen crisis. We have seen World War I, World War II, Spanish flu, cholera, plague. Every 100 years we get hit. And in a VUCA world, this is how we have been hit. May be unexpected, but definitely everybody knew we are living in a VUCA world. So I think we must take that for granted. It will come back, but it's going to take a year to come back. And it will come back in very different ways. People may not want to go shopping from one dealership to another. Social distancing can become a practice in the medium term, next 2 or 3 years. So you can configure a vehicle on the net. Digitalization will become very important. Even advertising will go digital. And as Mr. Mathur was saying, I think Industry 4.0, entire supply chain visibility, I think we're going to have a great impetus to digitalization of the whole economy.
So, Mr. Mukundan, how does one stay optimistic in this scenario? What do you tell yourself every morning when you look at bad news on the medical front or bad news on the economy? How do you convince yourself that tomorrow will be better than today?
I think human race has seen many, many challenges before. This is one we are facing, we'll overcome. That is very clear. Second is the near term is not so near and the long term is not so long. It's not going to take 10 years for the long term to come. It will come in 3 years. And the near term, we will deal with it the way we are dealing with it. And I am pretty sure that India has done a good job, as Puri said at the beginning, that we've done a good job right at the beginning, he mentioned, in terms of handling the medical emergency. We will also do a good job in doing all the steps which are needed in terms of confronting economic challenges. But we need more agility, more speed. All the ideas are there and they need to be executed. That's all. I think execution is the key.
We've spent a good 60 minutes discussing and understanding what needs to be done and what could be the economic vaccine. So I'm going to thank all of you for your valuable time. We met at a time when indeed the situation is as unprecedented. We are using words like panic and slowdown. But let's hope that next time when we meet, we are discussing better things, good growth, and better news on the medical front. Thank you all of you. Stay safe. And once again, on behalf of everyone from ET, thank you for your valuable time. It means a lot to our viewers. And thank you for your comprehensive and candid views.